Thank you. My name's Ben. I'm from the University of Brighton. I run an undergraduate architecture course, and I first encountered cybernetics when I was studying architecture at the Bartlett, which is UCL some time ago, and I met someone called Ranulph Glanville. Ranulph Glanville was someone who studied with Gordon Pask, and he had encountered him at the AA, the architectural school there, and so I come from this kind of tradition and position of seeing cybernetics and design as things that are overlapping and contributing to each other in various ways. So I finished just give you a bit of where I am with my research. I studied with Ranulph and with Neil Spiller. I finished that PhD about 4 years ago. And since then I worked on a research project about Pask at the Cedric Price Archive in Montreal, looking at the Funpowers project that Professor Pickering mentioned earlier. I'm very grateful for the invite to be here today. Bernard Scott invited me. He can't be here today because he's unwell, unfortunately, and he asked me to talk about cybernetics and ethics, which is part of the work and the research that I was doing with Ranulph. I'm going to present some material that's quite new, so this is in draft form, and I'd be very grateful to whatever comments or suggestions you have afterwards. Okay, so cybernetics and ethics. Why is that an interesting thing to discuss together? Well, I think cybernetics has relevance to many of the contemporary ethical issues that we face. We can think that some of the ethical issues in political discourse, ecological crises, the pervasiveness of technology, epistemological questions about responsibility over truth claims are all particularly present in these past couple of years, our present moment. And these combine ethical issues with some of the systemic issues and concerns with which cybernetics is focused and can reflect on. Cybernetics also has very particular reflections on ethics. I'll try and give a summary of those in the first half of the paper. And a lot of these revolve around our stance towards the world and around questions of how we know about the world. And this, I think, is not to treat something like that, which is a sort of metaphysical, theoretical kind of thing to engage with. This is not to kind of park that off as a theoretical thing that doesn't have any, that's abstract from everyday life and so on. We see the consequences of these things, of how we make claims about what's true, how we build, how we make our stance in the world manifest in buildings, in technologies. We see the consequences of these all the time in very physical ways. And I'm sure if you just think back to some of the things that are in the news over the past couple of years, you can think about how some of these issues change even the boundaries of our country and so on. So as a sort of summary of cybernetic observations about ethics, it's notable for its recognition of ethical considerations within some of the processes that we use to know about and act in the world. So for instance, conversation, which is kind of central cybernetic process for Pask in particular. This involves ethical processes within it. The same can be said of design, and the same can even be said of science. So from the point of view of cybernetics, the ethical is part of these practical activities, or practical social activities, rather than an external constraint upon them. It's a response to, and this is a response to a critique we can make of ethical philosophy. So ethical philosophy can be criticized for operating in a way that is very distinct from any actual problems we encounter. So the stance it generally takes is the dispassionate judge looking at events from outside, where it has a full knowledge of events and to decide what was the right thing in this instance. This is a fairly useless body of theory when we actually have to do something. So within the kind of world that we're engaged in, particularly designers, I think are very conscious of this, where it is not the boundaries of the situation are evolving as we work. Nicholas Negroponte, who was an architect who founded the MIT Media Lab, who worked with PASC, he would talk about the design process as the procurement of the information that's missing in the brief. So at the beginning of a design process, you get a brief, what your client wants, you answer it, and they said, oh, I didn't want that. And this is part of the process. And designers worry that their clients keep changing their mind, but this is actually a reframing of the question, a reframing of the brief. So new criteria, new things emerge all the time within that process. So ethical systems such as deontology, consequentialism, which claim to guide us in these things, don't really work in design, and I'd move that they don't really work generally in practical circumstances. So in part of the sort of whole project of which the paper I give now is a part, I'm interested in an alternative stance towards ethics. So contemporary ethics, which, as I will contextualize briefly later, is in a contemporary state of confusion where there's very little agreement on anything or any sign of agreement. So for instance, an example of this is driverless cars, which was mentioned earlier, which has become a kind of prominent place for ethical philosophers to show the impact of their research. And what we see is that methods for sharpening what is at stake in a question, so the trolley car problem, is just being used as a way for driverless cars to resolve practical ethical questions, which is a very odd, well, it's either a very odd or a very brave thing to be doing. So we see within technological developments like that, ethical questions becoming very prominent within some of the things we're designing, because now we're designing things that themselves must practically reason. Okay, so summary of this paper. First, I'm going to summarize some of the ideas that cyberneticians have that are relevant for ethics. I'm going to talk slightly about Ranulph Glanville, who's my supervisor and was a fellow of this society. Norbert Wiener, who is often considered the founder of cybernetics and is certainly one of the most prominent early members. Margaret Mead, who's also a very prominent early member. Heinz van Förster, and a little bit from some other people connected with him. So generally, I'm going to characterize various things they have come forward with as the idea that there are ethical considerations within some of our practical ways of going on in the world and knowing about the world. So that's the first part. The second part, I'm going to identify similar kinds of questions that occur within ethical discourse itself. So I'm going to locate so the first part is that there are ethical considerations within metaphysical, epistemological, ontological questions. I'm going to then locate those questions within ethical discourse, and that will lead us to an understanding that ethical considerations arise recursively within those considerations in ethics itself, which will become clearer by the time I finish. Also, why that is important, why we might be interested in a recursive ethics, will hopefully become clear too. Okay, so firstly, Ranulph Glanville. He argued that cybernetic processes, such as conversation, the black box, and various others, are such that they require ethical qualities of us. So if we're to undertake conversation practically, in practically good terms, it requires something of us which we would generally describe as a desirable ethical quality. So for instance, to sustain a conversation, we need to respect and listen to others, to the other participants in the conversation. If we don't do that, that might be taken as rude, but it also means the conversation descends into something else. So if we don't listen to each other, then there is no exchange, and the conversation isn't a conversation anymore, it's two monologues that happen to be occurring at the same time, taking turns. What's striking about that is for a conversation to work, we don't actually need to understand each other correctly, and we don't need to agree. So conversation is fueled by difference, but it relies totally on listening, and so ethical quality of respect. Conversation is one way of thinking about design, and so we can also think of design as involving that kind of quality as well. So Glanville goes through a series of arguments like that. He doesn't position it this way, but it's clear that this is what we would call a virtue ethics argument. So there's a practice, here conversation, and this requires of us a certain character. And this practice may also be helpful in developing this character. So I could develop respect, a characteristic of respect, a virtue of respect, through engaging in conversation and becoming better at it. Virtue ethics is a revival of an Aristotelian approach to ethics, associated with philosophers such as G.E.M. Anscombe and Alistair MacIntyre. Now, there are wider parallels with cybernetics and the Aristotelian tradition, which we can summarize in terms of purpose. So virtue ethics is a recovery of a teleological or purposeful ethics, which is built around an idea of a coherent telos or end or goal to our lives. This purpose is a central theme to cybernetics at its outset in the 1940s, and it's, for instance, the subject matter of the Rosenbluth, Wiener, and Bigelow paper that was mentioned earlier. This paper is a dramatic reintroduction of purpose as a respectable topic of discussion into science. It had been moved away from in the shift in the Enlightenment to modern science in favor of a linear and mechanical account of causality. This was because of a suspicion over final causes, introducing a kind of metaphysical element into science. By giving so final causes that people are reluctant to embrace because there's something a bit fishy about the cause happening after the thing it caused. But by giving a circular account of causality, cybernetics removes this problem because everything is sort of always happening at the same time within the process. So we can think of this using the eponymous example of steering a ship. So in steering a ship, we kind of think, what's the goal of steering the ship? Oh, it's to get to the port. And we know that there's a kind of circular interaction where we take feedback from the environment and we adjust the way we're steering and we get there in the end. The port there is a goal which is external to the act of steering, if we consider the boundary of steering within the action of the steerer and the ship, let's say. We can contrast that, so an understanding of teleology in terms of an external goal with one that stresses the internal goals that allow that to be pursued. And I think this happens, this emerges within cybernetics, within the theories and within the things that are made. So if I'm steering a ship, I don't actually need to think about the goal in terms of the port. I can think about the goal of staying on course, so maintaining a stability within the changes in the environment, which might blow me one way and blow me another. So I'm maintaining a stability between what I'm doing and what the environment's doing, so that all of this is aligned with some external thing. Now, what's interesting about that is it's a description of purposefulness or causality which is not determined by some external factor, so not open to the kind of critiques of teleological history or so on. For instance, that I can maintain a goal internal to my practice of steering means that when I round a headland, I might see something I've never seen before and I might head off down there. So the ability to keep on course for the port also allows me to change direction and explore other things that emerge within the process. This is very important for designers because designers, as I said before, the goal isn't explicit or told at the beginning, but is something that is brought to light or created during the process of exchange with the materials of the situation. Okay, so in virtue ethics, which is emerges as a competitor to other forms of ethical theory from the 1980s onwards, there's a contrast between that and consequentialism. Consequentialism, like utilitarianism, would be the attempt to get to the port. So the definition of of our actions as good in terms of some external goal. Virtue ethics gives us a focus on our internal qualities like the character of respect and so on. Okay, Wiener's concern with purpose can also be thought about in terms of his remarks in his second book, The Human Use of Human Beings, from 1950. This is a critical account of the social consequences of technological and scientific change. And the central point, or the point that strikes me, is he reflects on the tremendous buildup of know-how that we had at that point. We have amazing know-how, but we don't really have an idea of what we're trying to achieve with it, or thinking through the consequences of what this will mean for society. That's a critique which he gives of this post-war technological optimism, and it's one we can apply today. So we have tremendous know-how and ability with technology, communication, and so on, but we have a tremendous set of conflicts over really what we're trying to achieve with that. One thing that can be understood in a similar vein to this later on in cybernetics is Margaret Mead's address to the inaugural meeting of the American Society for Cybernetics in 1967. She called for cyberneticians to take responsibility for the social consequences of their discourse or of cybernetics, i.e. for cybernetics to critically account for itself and the social changes it caused. One way Mead's remarks have been developed, and I understand this as a specific instance of following up on Mead, is in a critique of scientific objectivity and a critique of this within cybernetics. This is developed by Heinz von Förster. So reflecting on scientific research as a cybernetic process, and we might, in current issues in design research, reflect on scientific research as a design process in a similar way. It's clear that this is not independent of our purposes, as it's often presented. So there's a paper around a similar time by the Nobel Prize-winning biologist Peter Medawar, which is the scientific paper a fraud? So the issue is not a critique of the, so that there's a presentation of science and an appreciation of it within culture, which reflects something that reflects its independence from us or from science and gives it a different status. So that's what von Förster is critiquing. It follows that our knowledge claims, including those we make in science, so something that is thought, when we get to the ethical bit of this paper, something that is thought as a paradigm of a certain approach to ethics, and are subject to ethical considerations. We have responsibility for them. They're bound up with the purposes that we pursue and with our relationships with others and with the world. And I guess they're also contingent on situations and spaces we find ourselves in. There are similar arguments, one made by Ernst von Glasersfeld, which is called radical constructivism, which I'm going to return to because the way he formulates it is helpful for part of my argument, and also by Glanville, whose paper in 1980 at the Design Research Society talked about science as a form of design activity. And this was in contrast at the time to various attempts to import science as a kind of neutral, rational, good practice idea into design, which was a general failure. I think all of that as a kind of critique can be compared with the work of Paul Feyerabend at the similar time in the philosophy of science, particularly his Science in a Free Society, which I've looked at again recently, and I think it's very interesting to read that now in the context of issues of decolonization. So he argues that there's an apparent equality offered by modern science, but this is actually a quality given in terms of Western white men. So the neutrality that is offered within modern science isn't really neutral, it's already partial. That the assumptions, his conclusion is that the assumptions in which science is based and under which it operates require political legitimacy and oversight. Okay, so radical constructivism. Understood in cybernetic terms, our understanding of the world and our claims to knowledge about it are things we are responsible for. They're intertwined with our purposes and our agendas. One formulation of this critique, radical constructivism, is given by Ernst von Glasersfeld. He's described it as what he called a post-epistemological position. So it's an attempt to change how we talking about knowledge at a very fundamental level. So generally, epistemological questions have revolved around attempts to justify our knowledge, and justify that our knowledge matches or corresponds to or tends to something beyond our experience. Von Glasersfeld attempts to reframe this question, hence radical. Radical comes from the Latin for root, from which we also get radish. Hence radical. In principle, we cannot examine the relationship that is between our understanding of our experience and the world that's beyond our experience, because we can't access the latter. So if what we're trying to do in epistemology is take our understanding of our experience and justify it matching the world beyond our experience, we can never really get at that question. But this isn't really a problem, because we can reframe questions of knowledge as really being about this world. So being about the world of experience and practical action, pragmatism, and orientation within that world, including of the constraints that we experience on it. So this gives us an idea of knowing as a practical activity, and rather than a representational one. So not knowledge of something, of another world that we're trying to get to, but a way of dealing with and coping with the world we experience. That's very amenable to design. So a lot of this is something where cybernetics has influenced design and how designers think about their practices, and also how their practices might relate to research. Because designers are always dealing with a world which is for. So they make models for things rather than of things. So an example of this is actually from Pasq. And this is one of the reasons why Pasq is someone who engaged with designers in a very natural way throughout his career. So Pasq's Musicolor, which Professor Pickering spoke about, this happens before Pasq is a cybernetician. This happens, he's building this on his table. He's not thinking what this is going to, this isn't coming from a theoretical enterprise. He's doing this, and conversation theory, which is his theoretical tour de force, if you like, happens 20 years later, but all of the insight in it is already, you can find it in discussing Musicolor and what it did or what it would have done. Okay. So this is sometimes framed with a pair of questions. First one, am I apart from the universe, meaning whenever I look, I'm looking as if through a peephole on an unfolding universe? Or two, am I part of the universe, meaning whenever I act, I'm changing myself and the universe as well? So these are two radically different stances for being in and understanding the world. From a design point of view, we can definitely see that design involves being part of the situations we're engaged with, part of the world, and we can look at things like Rittel and Weber's wicked problems, where the attempt to investigate any problem, the attempt to design for something, actually reconfigures its substance. So we can never quite get it because the attempt to solve it is part of the situation. It's always reconfiguring itself and is never statable in definitive terms. An example of that is you can't build a motorway to work out if you want to build a motorway. This is partly because of the resources you consume in that event, but also because even if it wasn't a matter of resources, you can do it and untake it, you can never unpick all the consequences of the first action, how people would respond to a second attempt. Okay, so here are two different ways of looking at the world. The choice between these is undecidable or unknowable because it's not something we can resolve. We can't escape our experience to check on the relationship between our experience and the world beyond it. It's not something we can adduce support to resolve in one way or the other. It looks at first sight like a choice between a constructivist and a realist stance, or constructivist and realist epistemology. One might therefore expect radical constructivism to choose the part of choice, right? So it looks like there's a constructivist world where we're changing the universe and ourselves, and there's a realist world where we're passively observing. Strictly, though, the radical point of radical constructivism, then an objective position, the objective status of an objective position is something we have given it, and this creates obvious tensions. So there's a kind of inconsistency there which has to be dealt with in some way. Now, this tension actually has a very interesting parallel in ethics with the breakdown of the Enlightenment, what we can summarize as the Enlightenment project of justifying morality. So McIntyre, who I mentioned earlier, emphasizes the book Either Or by Soren Kierkegaard. And this is a moment where, after the attempt to put morality on a non-traditional, rational footing, the various methods of doing that basically all cancel each other out. And by the time we get to Kierkegaard, we're left with the basis for morality becoming individual criterion-less choice. So we have a tension between an individual thing that just has to be chosen, and an arbitrariness to that, and the obligatory force or the universal consequences of making that decision. So in Kierkegaard, it's not a case that we choose between good and evil, but that we choose whether to choose in these terms or not. This is the starting point for a general state of confusion and disagreement in contemporary ethics. And even on matters where there is consensus as to an action being right or wrong, we have no agreement on why this is the case. Now, as with wicked problems in design, it's not so hard to come up with a solution to that. But part of the problem is the different solutions we come up with all have different consequences. We can offer lots of ways of dealing with it, but these themselves come into conflict. And this is what we experience in everyday or contemporary moral debate, where we have a tendency to resort to different first principles, and so clashing arguments which have no way to be brought into a commensurable relationship with each other. Okay. So, I previously gave a kind of choice of questions. I'm apart from the universe, I'm part of the universe. So, knowledge or being is a kind of independent passive arrangement, and it's something that I'm engaged with and which is changeable and unpredictable. A very similar question arises within ethics, so within ethical discourse, specifically within metaethics. Metaethics is the philosophical inquiry into questions, the deepest questions about ethics. What is it? What is value? What is an ethical statement? And so on. And this is the question of mind dependence or mind independence of value. So to phrase this, namely whether things are valuable ultimately because we value them, or whether we value things ultimately because they possess a value independent of us. So this is a reformulation of a very old question, which went something like, are the gods pious because piety is good, or is piety good because the gods are pious? So that is a question of whether normativity, so whether the question of something being an ethical norm, is best understood as something conferred, something we give, or something recognized. This is similar to the invent, discover, realist, constructivist choice. However, it's a lot more complicated and interesting in ethics, I think. Instinctively, we position constructivism on the anti-realist side of this divide. So instinctively, we think, and constructivist positions like social systems theory and constructivist psychology would start talking about how society constructs and forms stable values and so on. And Heinz von Förster does this as well in his description of eigenforms. So this is where a number of different participants, and we can think about them in a group such as this, by trying to understand each other's understanding through each other, we can align those understandings. So through this, we can develop shared agreements over questions about norms. So ethical questions, social questions, and so on. I think there's reasons to be very cautious about this. So that step of assuming that a constructivist position lines up in one of these questions. This is because those kinds of theories I just mentioned, so social systems theory, constructivist psychology, these deal with descriptive accounts of ethical norms and the way they're formed. They're very helpful in understanding those things, but they are not necessarily the same as a normative ethics, so a theory of what the good is. This is an understanding of what the good is believed to be by a particular group. The ethics is what we negotiate it to be, we being a point of massive difference amongst everyone, would require the resolution of undecidable questions about value. So if you were to take, say, Luhmann's position, or von Furster's eigenform position, as describing the way that as describing how the ethically good, an idea of the ethically good action is formed, then we'd need to resolve that other decision. So we'd need to resolve that choice between whether we make value or whether we find it in one way. And doing that creates some interesting problems, right? So we can think about the way that norms are negotiated by one group and how these might differ to be how they're negotiated by another group or at another time, and what our view of that is. So that's a kind of inside-outside question. So we can ethically critique norms that are negotiated within one group, but of course then we're doing that within our group and so on. So the point is just that that position requires the resolution of the previous question, which is an undecidable question, like the other question of, am I part of the universe? And that can be resolved in ethics in all kinds of ways. So McIntyre's own philosophy, where values are formed in relation to particular forms of social life, can also be thought of here. And we can think about whether some values are things that are independent of us and some are not. The point of what I'm doing today is not really to resolve any of that, but to note that we can recognize that here is an example of an epistemological question or a question about our stance that arises within, is entailed within our attempt to resolve ethical questions. And as we saw before, there are ethical questions of consistency, responsibility that arise within epistemological ones. So in how we understand how we understand the world, this is not something that is neutral or independent of us. This is something we are doing, therefore we're responsible, therefore ethics enters in, and that is nested within a set of questions that happen within ethical discourse about value. So the whole thing appears within itself. So there are ethical questions nested within ethical discourse and reasoning. This we can think of as a recursive entry of ethics into its own domain. We can also think of it as an ethical critique or enabling an ethical critique of ethical practices. Why might that be important? So firstly, in terms of coping with moral disagreement. So I think moral disagreement characterizes the world of ethical discourse. We have all kinds of theories to resolve everything, but no way to resolve between the different ways we can resolve them. This has a tendency, as McIntyre points out, to resort to clashes of first principles, to resort to moralization. And we can see this everywhere today. We can see this in our public discourse. I don't think, I'm not optimistic about how to resolve that, how to resolve those substantive questions. But the conduct of such debates is also something which is an activity which we can think of as something to which ethical considerations apply. So the way we reason about and the way we debate and negotiate ethical questions is an activity, and so ethics as something that teaches us how, or claims to advise us how to act in a good way, is something that applies to that. there's a tendency not to see this. This is a sort of difficult question to give light to, because when we normally engage in ethical reasoning, we do so, or the traditional way of doing so, is from a position that gives us advice on what is the good, what is a good way of acting, so a normative ethical position. Consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics is one of those. Because this theory claims to advise us as to how to act in a good way, we don't necessarily reflect on whether and how we might communicate or reason through that theory. We think that, it's easy to think here that my convincing you of this theory is really good because it's the theory of how to act well, so it's justified, right? However, we know that this leads to some pretty horrible activities towards each other. Can I just ask how much time I have?
0.
0, great. So I will stop there. I think architecture is a very interesting example for doing